Picture this. You wake up one morning as a free person. By afternoon, you are inventory. No trial, no crime, no warning. Just the machinery of the ancient world doing what it did best, converting human beings into economic units with the same administrative efficiency it used for grain shipments and tax records. This is not a movie. This is the documented reality of life inside the largest slave economy the ancient world ever produced. We've all seen the Hollywood version. Muscled gladiators, dramatic escapes, noble suffering with a heroic ending. What we haven't seen is the paperwork, the price lists, the legal codes that defined exactly what a human being was worth and in what condition they could be returned for a refund. Because Roman slavery wasn't just brutal, it was organized, documented, and completely unremarkable to the people who built one of history's greatest civilizations on top of it. Today we're going inside that system, not the mythology, the actual record. The world you just entered. At its peak, roughly 1 in 3 people in Roman Italy was enslaved. Let that number sit for a moment. Not a minority, not an underclass, 1/3. The Roman economy didn't run on slavery the way a machine runs on fuel. It was the machine. Agriculture, construction, mining, education, medicine, administration, entertainment, all of it built on the labor of people who legally owned nothing, including themselves. How did you get here? The routes into slavery were multiple, and none of them required you to do anything wrong. You could be born into it. If your mother was enslaved, so were you. Roman law was clear on this. The child follows the womb. You could be captured in war. Rome was almost constantly at war, and defeated populations were a standard part of the spoils. After the Third Macedonian War in 168 BCE, the Roman general Aemilius Paulus enslaved 150,000 Epirotes in a single campaign. Not killed, enslaved. After Carthage fell in 146 BCE, 50,000 people were sold in a matter of weeks. You could also be kidnapped. Pirates in the Mediterranean ran a thriving trade in human beings throughout the Republic and Empire. The young Julius Caesar himself was famously captured by pirates. He was ransomed. Most people weren't. You could be sold by your own family. In times of famine or debt, fathers had the legal right to sell their children. This happened. It was documented without particular moral comment. And you could be born free, then fall into debt slavery. Though Rome officially abolished this in 326 BCE, officially. The first thing that happened when you arrived was that you lost your name. You were given a new one, usually Latin, often chosen by your owner. Marcus, Felix, Fortunatus, which means lucky, which tells you something about Roman irony. Your original name, your language, your hometown, your history, none of it was relevant anymore. You were property. And like all property, you needed to be registered. The reality of the inventory. Here's the part that most documentaries skip. Roman slavery was not one thing. It was a spectrum, and where you landed on that spectrum determined whether your life was merely controlled or actively unsurvivable. At the top, if you can call it that, were the educated slaves. The Greeks were particularly valued here because Rome had conquered a civilization it considered culturally superior, and educated Greeks became teachers, doctors, accountants, and secretaries for wealthy Roman households. A Greek tutor in a senator's home might eat well, sleep in a reasonable room, and have some degree of autonomy over his daily routine. He was still property. He could still be beaten, sold, or punished at his owner's discretion. But compared to what came next, his situation was almost livable. Then there were household slaves, cooks, cleaners, personal attendants, messengers. Large aristocratic households might have hundreds of them. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder mentions a man named Caecilius Isidorus, who died in 8 BCE and left behind 4,116 enslaved people in his will. Just left them, like furniture. These domestic workers lived in close proximity to their owners, which meant they had some protection from the most extreme violence, simply because their owners saw them daily, and killing your cook was inconvenient. It also meant they had zero privacy, zero personal space, and were available for any service their owner demanded at any hour. And then there were the mines. If you ended up in the silver mines at Lorient in Greece or the gold mines in Spain, your life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. The historian Diodorus Siculus visited these mines, and what he described is almost unreadable. Workers in chains, no daylight, insufficient food, brutal overseers. He writes that the men prayed for death as a relief from their suffering. This was not exaggeration. Archaeological evidence confirms it. The skeletal remains found near Roman mining operations show extreme wear, malnutrition, and injuries consistent with continuous heavy labor under violent conditions. The agricultural estates, the latifundia, were somewhere in between. You lived in barracks. You worked from before sunrise to after sunset. You were chained at night during harvest season because running away during that period was common enough that owners had decided chains were worth the cost. Columella, a Roman writer on agriculture, recommends in his handbook, his actual farming handbook, that overseers should be selected for their willingness to use discipline, but not for enjoying it too much, because an overseer who enjoyed punishing workers was less efficient. This is the level of abstraction Romans applied to human beings. The complications. Here's where it gets morally complicated. Because Rome also had a system unlike almost any other ancient civilization. Manumission, the formal legal process of freeing an enslaved person. And Romans freed people, a lot. By some estimates, the majority of enslaved people in Rome who survived long enough were eventually freed. Freed not from generosity, but from practicality. A freed slave, a libertus, remained legally bound to their former owner as a client. They owed labor, loyalty, and support. Freeing someone was often less expensive than keeping them enslaved and created a loyal dependent who now participated in Roman civic life. This created a genuinely strange social category. Freed slaves could own businesses, accumulate wealth, and their children were born fully free Roman citizens. The satirist Juvenal complained bitterly about former slaves becoming wealthy and powerful, which tells you that some of them did. The Trimalchio in Petronius's Satyricon, a vulgar, obscenely wealthy freedman who throws ridiculous dinner parties, was a comic figure, but he was also recognizable. These people existed. Now here's what that complicates. Some Romans genuinely believed their system was more humane than others because of manumission. Philosophers like Seneca wrote that enslaved people were human beings deserving of respect, that the wise man treated them with consideration, that fortune alone separated master from slave. Seneca also owned hundreds of enslaved people and did not free them. His philosophy and his behavior were not in conflict in his own mind because he was writing about the ideal, not prescribing his own conduct. The Stoics, your Senecas, your Epictetus, who was himself formerly enslaved, developed sophisticated arguments about inner freedom that were partly shaped by the reality of slavery. Epictetus argued that no one could truly enslave your mind, which is a profound philosophical idea. It is also, when you think about it, a philosophy that makes slavery more endurable rather than one that challenges it. What was erased? Most of what we know about Roman slavery comes from the owners. The legal codes, the agricultural manuals, the philosophical texts, the histories, all written by free men, most of them wealthy. We have almost no first-person accounts from enslaved people themselves. This is not an accident. Literacy among enslaved people was actively controlled. Educated slaves were valuable, but a fully literate population that could write its own history, correspond secretly, organize, that was dangerous. The documents that survive are the documents that owners found useful to preserve. The voices that don't survive are the voices that would have told us something owners didn't want recorded. What we do have are glimpses. The graffiti on walls at Pompeii includes markings that scholars believe were made by enslaved workers. Brief, often crude, sometimes just names, proof that people were here, that they existed, that they wanted to leave a mark. There are legal records of trials involving enslaved people, which show us something about their circumstances through the language of their oppressors. There are the records of the slave revolts, Spartacus in 73 BCE, the First Sicilian Slave War in 135 BCE, the Second in 104 BCE. Tens of thousands of people fighting, not for a philosophy, but for the basic condition of owning their own lives. The revolts were crushed. After Spartacus was defeated, 6,000 enslaved rebels were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, a road lined with dying people for 200 kilometers. This was not hidden, it was the point. The display of consequence was the message. When colonial-era historians and later Western scholars wrote about Roman civilization, its architecture, its law, its philosophy, its literature, they wrote in a tradition that treated slavery as a background condition, a footnote, an unfortunate but separate matter from the real achievements of Rome. You learned about the aqueducts. You learned who built them considerably less often. What this means. Here's the thing about Roman slavery that never quite makes it into the textbooks. It wasn't a failure of Roman civilization. It was a feature of it. The Senate, the law courts, the philosophy schools, the architectural wonders. All of it was made possible by a system that converted human beings into units of economic output. The Romans knew this. They didn't hide it. They were, in their own way, honest about it in a way that later civilizations that built similar systems sometimes weren't. What they weren't honest about was the cost. The 150,000 epirotes sold in a single day. The miners who prayed for death. The names scratched into walls at Pompeii by people history chose not to remember. These weren't unfortunate side effects of greatness. They were the price of it, paid by people who had no say in the transaction. The next time someone tells you Rome was the foundation of Western civilization, they're right. They just usually leave out which parts of the foundation they mean. Dead honest. History they didn't teach you.